For more on the so far failed negotiations, we are joined by Trita Parsi of the Quincy Institute. Great to see you, sir.
Good to see you.
Good to be with you guys.
Yeah, of course. So let's go ahead and put this first element up on the screen from Barak Ravid, which claims to be the U.S. red lines from the negotiations. According to him, from a U.S. official, they said ending all uranium enrichment, dismantling all major nuclear enrichment facilities, retrieve highly enriched uranium, accept a broader peace, security, and de-escalation framework that includes regional allies and funding for terrorist proxies Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis. Fully open the Strait of Hormuz, charging no tolls for passage. One gap in the talks was the amount of Iranian frozen funds that will be released per source with knowledge. Your reaction to these purported U.S. red lines and also where we are right now in terms of any sort of resolution to the war?
If these are the American red lines and if these were the actual negotiation positions of the delegation in Islamabad, then I don't think there was any need for any negotiations at all. Those are dead on arrival. The US side knows it. I don't think this is accurately reflected in the talks. I think also there's a problem in which there's a diversity of views within the administration, and various people are trying to influence the final position by leaking these type of things and making them the reality. I do think also that in the talks, there were a lot of progress made, including on the nuclear issue, but at last moment, there was a shift on the American side, whether that was part of a negotiation tactic or whether that is yet another example of shifting goalposts, which unfortunately has become the hallmark of this administration's negotiations with Iran, remains to be seen.
Yeah, Dr. Parsi, let's talk about that because the foreign minister, Arachi, he came out and said, we had a memorandum of understanding basically ready to go. Then the shifting goalposts started. Now, I seem to think that's an allusion to the nuclear enrichment, as in a red line of zero enrichment. Let's be clear about where that came from. It appears to be an Israeli demand. Now, what's your view there of how that demand enters in the last minute? Is it Israel calling Trump saying this is unacceptable? How exactly did this go? How do the Iranians view their negotiations?
So we know that in the previous negotiations, this is a shift that occurred as a result of the Israelis pushing very, very hard for it and using their echo chamber in Washington, etc., to kind of push Trump in that direction. And that's part of the reason, a critical reason as to why the talks failed, because the only reason why the talks even began in the first place was because Trump kept on saying, my only red line is nuclear weapons, not nuclear enrichment or nuclear capability. Had he said from the outset that his red line is nuclear capability and enrichment, I don't think the Iranians would have come to the table in the first place. But once at the table, this shifted as a result of pressure from Israel. Whether that is the case here or not, again, remains to be seen. I can see a scenario in which, because of progress having been made, the US side kind of pulls back, knowing very well that there's still another week or so left of the ceasefire, sees what else it can get by adding some pressure. And then if it gets something else, and even if it doesn't, it will have formed a narrative of said that the Iranians caved because the US threatened to close the Strait of Hormuz or the Persian Gulf as a whole with a naval blockade, etc. So a lot of these things, I think, should be read as tactics within a negotiation rather than necessarily an end to the negotiations, because it's very important to keep two things in mind. Neither side has said that the talks are over. None of them. And neither side has gone back to firing at each other. So the ceasefire is holding. And if the ceasefire is holding, that means that the negotiations, at least nominally, may still be alive, particularly mindful of the fact that neither one of them have said this is over with, we're not going to meet again. And even J.D. Vance's speech or presser, he said, we have made our terms clear, the Iranians need to accept that or something like that. He didn't say it's over.
Yeah, that is a very important point. We talked some about the U.S.'s purported red lines, at least. What is your sense of what the Iranian red lines may be?
I think on the Iranian side, it's actually quite clear that may be part of the challenge they have in their negotiations. They're not going to give up the control of Strait of Hormuz, but they can consider various arrangements. The U.S. side did make some proposal on that. The Iranians rejected those. I do hope that the Iranians see a value in doing something with the US on this, because I think it will be very important for Trump as part of his narrative, but also because it may actually stabilize the situation if the US is in on it in some fashion.
So you're talking about actual sort of sharing the toll with the U.S., that sort of proposal.
Could be different. The U.S. proposal was sharing a toll. I think it could be other things. The sharing the toll seems to be something that at least the Iranians initially rejected. It could be other things, what the currency would be in which the tolls would take place in. It could be that the Iranians would use a percentage of the toll revenues, not to give it to the U.S., but to buy things from the U.S. So I think there's various ideas, et cetera, that can be further explored on that. And I think if it ends up becoming some arrangement in which both sides are involved in it one way or another, it can help stabilize the situation, because the critical thing is to make sure that the strait opens. The Iranian objective is not to close the straits. The Iranian objective is to use the control of the straits in order to reestablish economic relations with countries that have left the Iranian market. Right. The South Koreans have already come to Iran. The Japanese are about to do their own negotiation. These are countries in Asia that used to have extensive economic relations with Iran, but were chased out of the market because of the sanctions, because the US pressure on them was very intense. Now the Iranians are pressuring them back in through the Strait of Hormuz. It's not to close it.
Yeah, this is
But I think there's one thing I think is very important to understand, and in which the Iranians may actually have ended up in a relatively weaker position than they were in before. See, the United States or Trump could not end the war without some sort of arrangement with Iran, because the Iranians had a say in it. And this kind of forced him into a situation in which he had to ask for negotiations. But now that the Iranians have accepted a ceasefire, I think the tables have turned a little bit. The United States can now actually walk away from these talks and end up in a scenario in which the Iranians are controlling the straits, which is, from the US perspective, not good, but it's not devastating. It's much more problematic for other countries, particularly the GCC countries. The Iranians don't get any sanctions relief, but the US doesn't go back to war, and it kind of washes its hands of this whole thing, but just walks away. Doesn't give anything further, doesn't get a deal, but is out of the war, which I think is Trump's critical objective. Yeah. Oil prices would come down, etc.
But then what does Israel do in that scenario?
Let me get to that 1 second.
Yeah.
But the thing is, the Iranians want more than that. They want a framework agreement on how to manage the relationship between the United States and Iran. They want to move beyond the 47 years of enmity. They think that they finally have leverage to be able to meet the US face to face and get that. And that would, of course, entail a dramatic amount of sanctions relief, but also concessions from their end on the nuclear issue. From the Iranian side, that would be a much more valuable outcome from this, to make sure that they actually end this situation with the United States and get some sort of agreement, reestablish some economic relations. That's something the Iranians want. The US doesn't need this. The US could walk away and would end up in a still not an ideal situation, but not a terrible situation. The Iranians could also walk away, but they would lose more if they walk away. And this, I think, has in some ways changed the dynamics, because prior to the ceasefire, the situation was opposite. The United States could not walk away without an agreement from Iran.
Right. So what does that mean then? Crystal asked about Israel. So how would so if they did walk away, it would seem logical then that Iran would actually have to resume firing, because that would be the only thing that would draw the United States back to a situation where it had to reach this memorandum of understanding.
Depends. If the Israelis go back to war with Iran without the United States, then the Iranians undoubtedly will strike at Israel, and it will not be like before. They were not going to go into a scenario in which the Israelis slowly but surely, constantly increase the type of, a Gaza or a Lebanese scenario in which the Israelis gradually increase their attacks on Lebanon or on Gaza while the ceasefire is still in place. Mm-hmm. They will not accept that. So slightest thing from the Israelis, the Iranians are going to strike back very, very hard. Then the question is, if the war between Israel and Iran resumes, first of all, can the Israelis manage that without the United States being involved? I have my severe doubts about that, both from a military standpoint, from an intelligence standpoint, the amount of help the Israelis need, but also from a public opinion standpoint. Will the Israeli public go along with further war with Iran, in which they do take a lot of hits themselves, but without the US being part of the war? And I think that can change dramatically. it could also create a scenario in which the Israelis will, of course, do their utmost to get the US back into the war. And that will be a real test. If Trump has managed to pull out of this war, cuts his losses on the Straits, but then goes back in because the Israelis want it, again, I have a hard time seeing that happening. But then again, I was wrong about him going into this war in the first place because it was so utterly clear, in my view, that it would be a disaster. Yet he did it. But you can also see a scenario in which the US doesn't go back in, and then the Iranians have managed to achieve something else, which is they have truly separated the US from Israel. That would be a huge strategic win for the Iranians, which may be part of the reason why the Israelis actually won't go into the war again with the Iranians, knowing very well that that might be an outcome from that.